in church every time the doors were open. But as a teenager, your best friends you spent summers with were involved in one of the most horrible mass murders in the history of Georgia. What happened to you, Reggie?
Like you said, I was raised in a church, went there every moment I got, that the doors were open. But then when I was 15, Jimmy and Jerry, my best friends growing up, were murdered, all 6 of their family members. And I ran as fast and as far as I could from the God of my childhood. And I could not believe that a God that would allow something like this, so horrible, to even happen. And so I felt like at that time that he must not exist because he didn't help my friends stay out of that tragedy.
You did a little more than that, Reggie. Did you take your fist and tell me?
I really got angry. I ran as far as I could into the forest near my home and I shouted angry thoughts at God. I mean, I hit my fist against the tree and I said, God, you can't be allowing this and you must not even be here on this planet. I mean, or you not even exist.
So, his new God became science. And through science, he went to medical school, and they just reaffirmed that he should be an atheist until he saw one of the most beautiful things on earth. What was that?
It was the human body. I was sitting in the gross anatomy lab, and I looked, it was a piece of art. I could not fathom that this order came out of chaos. Something so beautiful as the human body. I had no other explanation other than an artist, a creator. And so I started to think there must be something else.
How did this defy your scientific understanding?
Well, I had been trained classically as a scientist in physics to realize that unless there is an outside force, order goes to disorder. That's physical law.
Yeah.
And of course the biologists kind of disagreed with that. They said that evolution explained everything, that we came out of disorder. So I could not really resolve that conflict in my mind as a scientist. So then I see the creation in front of me, the human body, and I realized the only way this could happen was with a creator.
But it still wasn't enough, because all that hurt inside of him, all that anger, all that rage, God, why did you do this? And some of you can relate to this. So God knew exactly what to do with Dr. Anderson. He saw the most beautiful woman at college and decided, I want to meet her. But there's a problem. What was the problem, Reggie?
Well, I asked her out on a date, and we went, and on the way home I was asking her for a second date, but she asked me a very important question. Are you a Christian? And I said the only thing I could think of, my parents are.
Oh, that must have helped a lot.
So in response to that, she said, I don't think we should date because my life is dedicated to Jesus Christ and your life is going on a totally different path.
But he keeps pestering her, and he overhears her saying to one of her girlfriends, this Reggie, he's an atheist and he's kind of a stalker. But that still didn't stop you seeing her, and so finally he goes off on a camping trip. He promises her that he'll read a book. What happened?
Well, she had given me a book a few weeks earlier called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and my mother had mailed a Bible to me. And I took those 2 books and I sat down by the fireside and I read straight through Mere Christianity, and I read the Gospel of John, and then I fell asleep. And I started dreaming, the most miraculous dream ever, for an atheist especially.
What was it?
Well, in that dream, Jesus came to me and he spoke these words. He said, Reggie, why are you running from me? Your friends are here with me in paradise. And I turned and I could clearly see Jimmy and Jerry and all their family, and they were well and healthy. And I wanted to be there with them. I did not want to leave that space with them. And then Jesus said, if you'll stop running and listen to my words, I have a plan for the rest of your life.
I mean, it was such a plan. He found out what he was supposed to do the rest of his life in heaven, in this dream. When we come back, you're going to find out, and it was preposterous to him, and surely preposterous to the woman. As a medical student, as a practicing atheist, goes to heaven. Tell me, as a doctor, what you saw, what you experienced in heaven.
Well, I turned and saw my friends who are healthy and well. I saw Jesus, and I felt his presence, and he spoke to me into the deepest part of my soul. And he told me things that I would experience later in life. He promised that if I would stop running from him, that all of these things would come.
Tell me basically what he told you.
He says, you're going to marry this young lady, Karen. You're going to have 4 children. You're going to practice medicine in Tennessee as a rural doctor. And all of these things have come true 33 years later.
33 years later. Okay, what about your friends? What about that young man in the woods saying, God, how could you do this?
Well, that experience with Jesus radically changed my entire spiritual DNA. I woke up not really understanding what was going on at that time, but I woke up a totally different man, totally converted into Christianity. And as soon as I got back to civilization, I bought a postcard and I wrote on that postcard to Karen, who would not even go out with me. I became a Christian. I had a dream. Jesus came to me. We're going to get married.
Did you picture that? Yeah. Okay, so you become a doctor. But you told me also you got this distinct impression, the whys of your friend's death.
Well, I felt like God knew before their death why that was going to happen, and that he had them in his arms even before they died, just like he has all of us in his plan even before we die.
Are you afraid of death?
Not at all.
How many people have you been with just before they die, would you say?
Hundreds.
Hundreds. Because God gave him a gift when he came back from heaven. All of his senses are so tuned into heaven, he can smell heaven, he can see heaven, he can feel heaven, he can tell the exact moment someone's spirit leaves their body. But the supernatural began to overtake him in his medical practice. For instance, explain to me what parting the veil means.
Sure. Well, the first time that it happened, I had just become a Christian, and I was in medical school still. And the job of the medical student was to stand vigil at the bed of a dying patient and to retrieve the attending whenever it happened. And so I was in this room in the VA hospital in Birmingham, and it was in the middle of the night, dark, sterile hospital room. And this man, I knew he was a Christian because his family had been in earlier and been praying with him. And as soon as he took his last breath, it was as if this door had opened on a spring day, and a kind of the citrus and lilac smell entered the room, as if God had come into the room to take this man's soul. And it lit up. It was no longer a sterile hospital.
What do you mean it lit up? I don't understand.
Well, you could just feel a warmth. You could see the lights instead of being dark, it was lit up just like the studio.
Now, did you see a specific light?
There was a glow, and it was up and to the right.
Yeah, but how do you know it wasn't one of your medical machines?
We had shut them off to make it quiet.
Now, what impact did that have on you?
Well, it made me think back to my dream, and it made me realize that the reality of where we are going is more real than where we are. That what we are experiencing here on earth is a dream compared to that reality of where we are going to be.
I mean, he's been with hundreds now just before they die. He knows the exact second they leave. By the way, when a Christian dies, you were telling me about the expression on their face. What have you noticed?
They always get the gaze of glory. They look up and to the right and they start to get this glow and they're smiling. They're believers that leave this planet to go to heaven. It's a joyous experience.
Tell me about Irene.
She was an elderly lady who had dementia, but she recognized me that night, and she was dying of a heart attack. But she had made it clear that she did not want to be resuscitated. And so, but she asked me one thing before we were going up to her room. She asked me to stay with her that night. She wanted to have an escort because she was going to meet Jesus that night.
She actually used the word escort.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, I was sitting there with her, and her heart started to fade, and her breath started to be somewhat labored. And I look at that, it's called chain-stoke breathing, but it's almost as if somebody is being born or birthed into another world. It's just like a woman going into labor and her breathing changes. And the veil parted, the room again opened up, and this sense of...
Now, when you say the veil parted, I mean, be more graphic with me.
Well, it's a very thin space between where we are now and where we're going to be. And that thin space, I think of it as a veil. I mean, I think of eternity really as not something we run toward as much as eternity walks right alongside us. And it's just one breath away. And once we take our last breath here, it's our first breath in heaven.
Well, that his hands are naturally cold. But when he examines a patient, what normally happens, Dr. Anderson, with your hands?
Well, they are extremely cold, and when I shake a person's hands, they usually comment on it. Even you said something the other day. And they start to warm up whenever I'm examining a patient and I find an area that's not normal.
Give me one example.
Well, I had one patient that I shook her hand, and she was just a friend of my mother's, and I asked her if she had had any thyroid issues, and she did not know of any, and I told my mom that she probably ought to check with her doc, and sure enough, 2 weeks later she called her mom and said, "You do have some thyroid issues." So,
well, you know, the thing that still amazes me about how he holds hands with hundreds of people, and you told me that there's almost like a breeze that you feel. Describe graphically things you see and feel and sense.
well, there was another case of a young boy that was in the emergency room that I had examined after he had injured his head, and I put my hand on his head where he had injured it, and there didn't seem to be anything outwardly wrong with him, and as a matter of fact, I was going to send him home with just some instructions. But as I was speaking the words to the mother, I said, "I think we need to send your young son to Vanderbilt to have a CT scan."
Why'd you say that?
I don't know to this day, other than God spoke those words through me. And
What happened?
4 hours after I sent him in, the neurosurgeon called me, and I was expecting him to kind of give me, up the country for sending a normal child in. But he said if you had not sent this child in, he would have died. He had a bleed inside his head, and we just finished surgery.
Tell me someone that died, medically speaking, came back to life, and told you what they saw.
Sure. She was suffering from a heart attack, and we sent her in to the cardiologist, and he discovered that she had a blockage. He took her to the cath lab, was doing a procedure to open the blockage, and she died. And he did CPR on her. She was flatlined for 2 hours. And he called...
You're sure she was dead? I guess flatline is shorthand for dead.
Right. Cardiologist called me and said, I don't know, I mean, we went on and on with this procedure because I had a resident that I wanted to train, on how to do CPR. And anyway, after 2 hours, she woke, her heart started. So we took her to the ICU.
Why did her heart start after flatline for 2 hours?
God only knows. And
medically, is there an explanation?
There was not any explanation, and neither did the cardiologist have one. He just said, her heart started despite, us almost.
So if he hadn't been experimenting, she would have died.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go on.
So 3 days later, she was in the ICU and woke up, and they extubated her. And the first thing that she wanted to tell the nurses was to call me. And so Karen and I went to the ICU in Nashville to visit with this lady. And the first thing out of her mouth was that she had been with Jesus and her family, and that she had wanted to tell me that where she had been was better than where she is now, and she wanted to get back there as soon as she could.
Was she upset that she came back?
She was very upset, and for 7 years she told me she was upset.
Tell me about a patient you had that was not going to go to heaven.
Yes, I had a few patients, but fortunately most of my patients have actually gone to heaven. But I have had one that I struggled with, constantly trying to bring him back to the Lord, because he was a man that had given up on God and many years of bitterness and that sort of thing. And at his bedside, when he took his last breath, it was very, very different than the ones that go to heaven.
What was different?
Instead of being smiling and happy and looking, he was very angry and almost fighting his last breath. And there was a sense of darkness and coldness in the room. So it had changed radically, very different from the one of my experiences with the patients that go to heaven.
What would you say to someone that is facing death right now that is a Christian?
What I would say is that you have nothing to fear, that the veil is very, very thin, that we're not running toward eternity, but eternity walks right alongside us, and it is waiting for us. Jesus is waiting right past the very thin veil, and that He is loving that we are coming to meet with Him.
And what would you say to someone facing death that has not believed that Jesus died for their sins, has not repented, and has not made Jesus their Lord? What would you say to them?
I would say, give up on the old life, accept that you are about to meet eternity, and that if you don't accept Jesus, the eternity that you're going to be part of is not a heavenly one. It is a hellish one. So I would recommend very clearly that you look for Jesus as your Savior.
I don't recommend. You say, here's a doctor. I tell people. I'm telling you, you do not know, even though you might have gotten a death sentence, and maybe you haven't even gotten a death sentence. You flat right. Don't know when your end will come, do you? Of course you don't know. But I know this. I'm a Jew. And when I was 30 years of age, Jesus came into my bedroom. And He's real. And I know my Orthodox Jewish father, who was just like Dr. Anderson with his hand in the fist towards God. I know that on his deathbed, he had an encounter with Jesus and said this prayer that I want you to say with me out loud right now. Say, I believe Jesus died for my sins.
I believe Jesus died for my sins.
And by His blood, God remembers my sins no more.
God remembers my sins no more.
And I'm clean. And now that I'm clean, I ask Jesus to be my Lord. Live inside of me. I'm going to heaven.